First letter to the Corinthians.
Blessed be the God and Father of our chapter 1 and verse 3. Fight the good fight. Timothy chapter 6 verse. And our subject is recovering from spiritual decline, the reforms and the work of Nehemiah, governor of Judah, so appointed by Artaxerxes, king or emperor of Persia. And particularly before us in this study will be priorities for churches in the aftermath of decline, or the clambering out of spiritual decline. And here in this first verse of chapter 7, we're introduced to further of the things which Nehemiah did, and their significance, and the lessons for us that rise from them. Now it came to pass, when the wall was built, and I had set up the doors, distinguishing this chapter from what has gone before. Now the doors are mounted, the walls are approaching readiness for formal consecration, and the porters, that is, the gatekeepers, and the singers, and the Levites, were appointed. Probably these appointments were made concerning worship in the temple. But many feel, well, it's a bit of a wrench to take the appointments away from the building of the wall and the setting up of the doors. So they feel, and some of the old writers, that with the gatekeepers there were singers and Levites functioning even at the gates of the city. We read nothing else about this, but it's possible. It was the holy city. It was a city of witness, the city of God, and even the very gates may have had stationed there people, a choir that sang, and the Levites who functioned in some way. There would be no sacrifices there, of course, no priests, but in some way so that all who came in and all who left had a witness. But most feel that, though the account is little telescoped, that the porters, the gatekeepers certainly apply to the walls, but the singers and the Levites were appointed to resume the worship in the temple, which had obviously been in action, but not in its complete form. And questions immediately arise. Only 13 years prior to this, Ezra had come with the party of people who came down from Ahava, from Babylon, and all the 40,000 plus people of Israel who returned to Jerusalem and to Judah once Cyrus the Mede had given consent for them to do so. Well, where had Ezra been? Because in the 13 years that separated his arrival from Nehemiah, Ezra was a priest, of course, came to set up and rebuild the temple. Nehemiah was more of a political administrator who served Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and was sent as a Jew at his own request to be the governor of Judah and to rebuild the walls and carry out further reforms. But if Ezra had been there all that time, how come there are worship reforms need to be done? And how come also that other things have to be established, as we shall see in the course of this chapter, like the reading of the law publicly before the people. And it does suggest, although there's no mention of this, that Ezra wasn't there all the time, that he carried out his work in Jerusalem and then returned back to Persia and then came back again during the course of this record, because here he turns up suddenly out of the blue in chapter 8. We'll come to that. And so many people think that Ezra had a period of absence and worship had decayed somewhat even in this very short time. But here anyway, under Nehemiah, the singers and the Levites were appointed. In verse 2, I gave my brother Hanani, who possibly was his literal brother, but possibly just a very close kinsman, but anyway, it was Hanani that had kept Nehemiah up to date with the terrible state of affairs in Jerusalem and brought him a report while he was still serving Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and prompted the flame in his heart which led him to seek a posting back to Jerusalem and to Judah. So Hanani had a long-term concern for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. He was a proven man. And Hananiah, the second name mentioned there, the ruler of the palace, charge over Jerusalem. Now, Hananiah we know nothing about, and so the basis of Nehemiah's decision is explained. End of verse 2. For he was a faithful man, referring more to his trustworthiness than his faith, spiritual faith, though he no doubt had that as well. He was a trustworthy man and feared God above many. His devotedness and his concern to obey God and his diligence, his concern not to be straying from the mark, was very conspicuous. So these two men were appointed by Nehemiah because they were qualified, conspicuously so, and they were going to have charge over Jerusalem because he was due to go back to Persia, to Susa, the capital of Persia, to have his commission as governor of Judah renewed and to report back to Artaxerxes what he was doing and how it was going. And so he appointed these two administrators or deputies in his place. But he doesn't go just yet. He gives them an opportunity to settle in. And verse 3, I said unto them, and these are very significant instructions, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun be hot. Well, you might well imagine that the gates would be opened at sunrise. But no, don't open them at sunrise is the instruction. Wait until the sun is high. The city is really alert. Wait a couple of hours after sunrise till everybody's up and active and there's an adequate defence force has assembled to do the work in the city, and then open the gates. So you've got to be super vigilant. The enemy will always take opportunity to get in. And while they stand by, which I think probably means while the guard is still there on parade, standing by and active, let them shut the doors. Don't delay the shutting of the gates until after the guard has dispersed or finished its duty and its term. Do it while they're still there and bar them and appoint watches of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. There weren't many inhabitants. Jerusalem was very low. As the people had returned from the former Babylonian Empire, all the places where they had been, well, they preferred to settle in the countryside, of course, where they could farm, even with the difficulties of awkward neighbours, and very few assembled in the city, which was ruins. And so this is something that Nehemiah had to put right, to repopulate the city. Some were there, and those who were there seemed to have built their houses or reconstructed them by the walls. And so there's this strange instruction, everyone, end of verse 3, everyone in his watch, and everyone to be over against his house. Station people right where their houses are. Now we might think that was a dangerous thing to do, because too close to home, you're always likely to slip away off your watch and enjoy the comforts of home. But more likely, it's a different line of reasoning. If you're conscious that your own family is right there, well, hopefully you'll be more vigilant on the wall. You have them in mind. You're protecting not just the city, but them. So people who'd made their homes against the inside of the city wall, even when it was largely in ruins, now were the watches over the city. Verse 4, now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded. So that is what is going to have to be done. And we'll come to that in a moment, but I'd like to say a little more about verse 3. The sequence of events in Jerusalem in its reconstitution was temple first, and Ezra came to rebuild the temple. Then 13 years after him, the wall next, under Nehemiah. And then, after that, the population and the houses were to be reconstructed. And that's very interesting. Temple, wall, houses. That's the order of God in recovering from decline. Temple, wall, houses. And you can see the significance. The temple had to come first. That which would be built, or at least the furnishings and the internal arrangements, would be exactly in accordance with Revelation. They would follow precisely. That was the ancient command from the tabernacle under Moses all the way on to the building of the temple and Solomon's temple. The instructions of God had to be precisely followed, and Ezra the priest came to supervise that. So obedience and worship came first in Reformation. Obedience to God. We'll say a little more about that, because even among Bible believers, there is nothing like as much obedience to God as there ought to be. How the church is ordered, how we go about things, how we do things. People are making innovations and inventing their own methods all the time in these days. But to recover from spiritual decline, the first thing was the great act of obedience, the careful construction of the temple, or at least its furnishings, it was a smaller temple than the original, in exact conformity with the details which God had redeemed. And then the wall comes next, the defense of the city. And we may say, if obedience and worship comes first, then the defining and the defense of the faith comes next. You have to preserve and defend the faith. Then the populating of the city comes third. That is to say, in our context, evangelism, the winning of souls, the populating and building up of the church. You can't do that until you know what the faith is, until you're ready to defend the faith. You've got a clear gospel and you stand for it. And you can't do that until you start worshipping in the first place and obeying God. And so this order of temple, walls, populating is followed still today in true reform, true reformation. If you leave any of those things out, or if you change the order, as people try to do today, well then you lose everything. And that's the trouble today. People say there are endless books on church growth and different methods and different ways of going about things, which are not the traditional ways and the biblical ways. And the great thing is church growth. But they're not worshipping as they ought to. And they're not obeying God. And they haven't properly defined and defended the faith. Not only the doctrines, but the practices. So everything is a pickle. And you're trying to populate the city when there's been no attention to the details of the temple, that is the worship, and no attention to the proper defining and defending of the faith. So even here, in the very order in Jerusalem, you can see the principle that must always be followed. Temple first, wall, and then the populating of the city. And I think it's very significant. Well, friends, I come down to verse 5. The city needed a population. And my God put into mine heart to gather together the nobles and the rulers and the people, that they might be reckoned by genealogy. And so Nehemiah wants a list. Well, a list already exists, as he'll soon find. Ezra, the priest, 13 years before, had done the most detailed list of all those who came returning from the former Babylonian territories to Jerusalem and to Judah, and the heads of the families and the numbers of the people and even the servants and so on, and the Levites, not many of those, and the priests were all listed most carefully. And so it existed, and he soon was presented with it, or found it, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it was most important because to have a list accomplished a number of things. Clearly, he would find from this list which families had property in Jerusalem or near to it before. And they would be, presumably, those who would get first place in the repopulating of Jerusalem and the new houses that were to be built there. But to have a list was very, very significant, because for the people, it would be a tremendous encouragement. It would help them to get a sense of nationhood once again. They were not just a motley collection of people. There was a genealogy, a list of their descent and their families and so on. And it would be encouraging in another way, because they'd perhaps become aware of this list and say, we never realized how many of our families would be preserved by God intact all through the 70 years in Babylon and all the troubles and the dispersal. And we thought it was trouble, trouble, trouble all the way. And now that we've been set free and enabled to come back, look, there's this cohesive nation, and the line of the families is preserved, uncorrupted to any great extent. This is the hand of God, surely. So any census or list or counting of the people would be a tremendous encouragement. Maybe it would impart to them a sense of responsibility. Certainly it would help Nehemiah to see the people in most need of any assistance and housing and things of that kind. But there is trouble with the list, and I must mention it, and you've probably read about it. This list is quite often attacked by Bible critics, because the list here in chapter 7 comes from the time of Ezra. Now, it's a list, a version of which also appears in the book of Ezra, beginning at the end of chapter 1 and going through chapter 2. So the list, you might think, ought to be the same, by and large. Well, in general terms, it is the same, but a lot of the names are spelt differently. From the list published here in Nehemiah chapter 7, which comes from the time of Ezra, it's Ezra's list. I found a list, he said, a counting of the people. Here it is, and he quotes it, but it's a fair bit different from the one in the book of Ezra. It spells a lot of names differently. It has some different names, but here's the biggest problem. If you've ever looked at this list, you'll see the numbers of the families that returned, and the numbers are about 20% different from the earlier list in Ezra. The numbers wave about. They're broadly the same, but there is a 20% difference in the numbers as given. And of course, Bible critics make hay with this. This just shows, they say, the enormous amount of scribal error in copies. These are versions of a list that are all less than 13 years old, and yet they vary so very much. Well, there are a variety of explanations for that are plausible and possible. It's possible that the list published in Ezra, which is described as a list of people who departed from Babylon, that may be a list that Ezra made literally before they left. All the people who volunteered, all the people who were meant to depart from the great rendezvous. Whereas another edition of the list, possibly the one found by Nehemiah 13 years later and included in this book, is the list maybe of the people who arrived, the list of people who, after a few months, when it was all revised possibly, were there. Because you could imagine that easily within 20% of number differences, you could account for that if a small number of people never actually turned up for the journey, didn't catch the bus, as it were, from Babylon back to Jerusalem, or a small number of people returned quite quickly. They had sickness or disillusionment or something, and they returned without completing the journey. And maybe others, at the last minute, in Babylon, had a change of heart